Lay a rag over the crankshaft and the opening of the oil pan and scrape off the carbon and degrease the timing chain cover sealing surfaces and scrape off any silicone or sealant of any kind on the oil pan lip. And then I'll be pouring probably a half quart of oil across the oil pan to flush out any excess solvent. While the timing cover is getting cleaned and these surfaces are being prepped, I'm going to drop the new timing chain into about a half quart of oil and let it soak. And that'll help save wear on startup. I purchased an OEM tensioner. Always use an OEM tensioner because I find the aftermarket stuff's usually substandard. This dampener takes a beating and it bends this metal down, and then the chain saws this off, and this gets caught in between the chain and crank sprocket and shears the chain. Which the one that was in this, that is what's happened to it. This was sheared off and this was busted. Typically the factory ones are green looking, but the metal's really hard and robust instead of soft. You can push on that pad and it bends very little and it keeps its shape. Put some lubrication on the crankshaft. Stick the crankshaft sprocket on the crankshaft. Always install it with the timing mark pointing out towards you. There's a divot there. This raised up lip is the wrong side to be facing you. If you install that backwards, you'll be unhappy about it. Take a deep well socket and tap it on there, something that won't blunt up the crankshaft. The dampener needs cleaned off, and if there's too big of a gouge worn in this, they sell a repair sleeve that you can drive over this to offset the wear on the seal, from the seal. I hardly ever have any issues out of them. The new seal's usually set in a different place. Take some carb cleaner, decarbonize the inside of this, especially the keyway and the outside of it, and some 400 grit sandpaper to clean that up. And you can kind of work on it just a little bit to help smooth that any sharp edge from the old seal out. You need to scrape any silicone out of the old keyway, degrease it for some new silicone. That's to help prevent oil from wicking past the key and slinging out onto the belt. And just rotate your sandpaper in a circular direction that the crank would turn in, and not like up and down, but in a motion circular. I propped the dampener hub up on there just a little bit, just a couple bolts in it, so I can rotate this crankshaft keyway to the 12 o'clock position. I should get it in the ballpark for it to be in time when I put the tensioner plate back on. The timing chain had been soaking in the oil for about an hour. That's fine. Went ahead and laid it up on a piece of cardboard to drain excess oil off. I'm going to go ahead and mount this tensioner bracket. The torque spread head goes along the tensioner arm, and 11mm goes along the dampener arm, because the chain will be running through here and needs the chopped heads to give it clearance. Those tighten to 18 foot-pounds. Looking pretty good. Put a few drops of oil on a cam thrust plate and behind it and on the face of it. So that the oil runs in behind it. Go ahead and grease these slides up a little bit with some oil. I've degreased the cam bolt. Fine tune your crankshaft sprocket so that the divot 3 teeth over from the keyway is pointing at the notch on the tensioner bracket. There's also another notch where the camshaft will be pointing at with this hole. Be sure your hands are clean. You can check your camshaft sprocket and fine tune the cam before you mount this on there, just to make sure it's in the right place. Be sure your pin's installed holding your tensioner back. Install the bolt, torque to 98 foot-pounds. It's a 24mm. I went with a drift punch. Stuck in the hole and wedged against the body and against the torque wrench. It did well. Be sure not to be turning the motor over with the camshaft, or you'll run the possibility of bending the hinge pin on that tensioner arm, and nobody will be happy about that. If it tries to flatten it out too much, could bend this pin here or break the guide, the tensioner block. So just don't apply too much force to it. Turn the crank if you gotta line up the holes up there. And pull this pin and the tensioner is loaded and lubricated. Take a cheap seal puller, pull the old seal out, the timing cover. Degrease your timing cover and clean it up. Take all the old silicone, if there was any on it, off. Went ahead and pressed the new cover seal into the slot provided for it. These cover bolt holes. It goes through the oil pan. Had the studs in it. are 3/4 of an inch deep. So we'll need some 10mm headed bolts below that, between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch long. Two of them. To put up to the oil pan in place of these studs. I suppose you could use longer bolts and cut them off, and then use the original nuts that went on the studs if you wanted to. I'm going to be using Right Stuff black silicone. It'll last longer. You can use regular black. It'll hold up for a good while. Just it's not as heavy duty as the more expensive Right Stuff version of black silicone. Make sure this is degreased and the oil pan and the timing cover faces degreased on the block. If you haven't done so already, degrease your timing cover bolts. Should be 7 of them. And if you have tubes of silicone that's been laying around you're planning on using, I usually put a test sample down about 5/16 of an inch thick and then drag it. It's been sitting there 15 minutes and it's tack free, so it's not shot. If it skims over in 15 minutes and not sticky anymore. Make sure all grease and silicone is off the oil pan lip. It's clean and dry. Make sure the face is clean and dry and bristle free. Test fit this cover on there dry once. And slip it back off. If you bring it back with crap all over it, you'll have to practice getting the cover on there before you go gluing it with silicone. And wipe off any excess oil that might be dripping off of the crankshaft sprockets so it don't get on the oil pan sealing lip. Have your timing cover bolts and the 2 oil pan bolts ready to go in. Make sure you didn't get any lint or debris on the sprockets. I'm going to start off by putting some silicone between the pan and this corner of the timing cover on both sides, and then about an 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch bead of silicone all around this lip, not getting anything on the crank sprocket. Right in the center of it. Kind of pull it down just a little bit so you have enough room to slip the cover between the crank sprocket. Just the edge of it. Feather a little bit. Look up and make sure some's in the corners. That's solid. sets up pretty quick, so gotta get on it. Just keep the cover. You want to go in with the bolt holes and these flat flanges flush with the oil pan. Keep it against the crankshaft sprocket. Tilt the cover out towards you at the top. Now start locating the dowel pins here, and one in front. Drop the cover down to them. Make sure you get some light on what's happening. Push the cover on. Dowel pin. The other dowel pin's lined up. Now let's start sticking the cover bolts in. Just mainly go after the two around the dowel pins. Take 5/16 or 8mm socket. And just bring them down a little bit. Not tight, just so it pulls the cover close. And stick the used 10mm up through the oil pan. And snug them down. Be sure you don't cross thread them. Bring it down till you just feel the head load down some more, and you might start to see some silicone press out and stop. Probably about 50 or 60 inch-pounds, getting both about even. Go ahead and tighten up the rest of the cover bolts. Evenly. Tighten all these cover bolts down gradually to 100 inch-pounds. And then tighten the oil pan 10mm down to 100 inch-pounds. Then drive in a new seal. Make sure the crankshaft's degreased around the keyway. Should see a good puffy bead sticking out all the way around it. And it'll be in good shape. I'm going to go ahead and use a deep well socket and drive this new seal in. Crankshaft's degreased. Because the hub's going to get a dab of this silicone put on the keyway. The new seal should melt flush, real close to it. And be perfectly flat all the way around. dents in it is not acceptable. Or distortions of any kind. This new seal will be lined with lubricant. Try to keep it off of the crankshaft keyway. The crank has been prepped, cleaned. There's a little bit of a ridge left over from the old seal wearing. As long as it isn't razor sharp on the edge of the trough that's wore in it, you're good to go. Or really deep, more than a 64th of an inch. It shouldn't have a sharp edge. If it had a sharp edge, I have to take some 320 or something to go around this and feather it out a little bit, but nice and even. If you wanted to, you could take some 320 grit sandpaper and run it through the inside of this a few times just to help clean it out and make it a little easier to go back onto the crankshaft. Not too much, just enough to shine it up a little bit. I put a light coat of motor oil on the outside of it. I'll put a touch of silicone halfway down this keyway, starting from the middle forward. That should be fine. Just don't get any on the outside of it. I'm going to put it on there. Do not beat on this flat surface with a hammer directly. You'll put dents in it and cause it to be irregular, pulley wiggle, or not fit. And the crank dampener's all the way down. Now it has to be all the way down, or the belt will run out of line, and the possibility of the sprocket working loose on the crankshaft wallering it out. It's down when about the width of the bolt is left sticking up. I wouldn't depend on the crank bolt to run it down necessarily. Snug this bolt down. You don't have a tool to tighten this down. Just take a piece of pipe and a hammer and tap this down until this washer gets loose, and snug this bolt down and tap it down until and snug the bolt down until the washer gets loose again, until it bottoms out. Say the crank's pretty soft inside, you don't want to depend on it to pull it down unless you got a all thread or something that's hardened. But I don't know. Sanding off the inside of it helps quite a bit. As long as you don't take too much off, you don't want it falling on there. Now would be an opportune time to change your oil filter, remove and or replace it. Go ahead and install this dampener arm. It has a dowel pin and a center bolt. It tightens to 38 foot-pounds. Stick the dowel pin in that hole and the bolt in the center. I'm installing the dampener pulley bolts, 38 foot-pounds, and the crank center bolt to 77 foot-pounds. I put some Loctite on the crank bolt just in case it has any problem. Went ahead and reinstalled the oil pan drain plug. Put a jack with a piece of wood on it underneath the oil pan right beside the drain. Raised it back up. I'll set this engine cradle on a jack stand. I'm going to go up top and put the power steering pump back on. These three bolts in the front's going to torque to 24 foot-pounds. The back can too. Got the power steering pump bolted back up. Put 4 quarts of oil in it. I'm going to start it up on the jack stand and jack before I put the accessory belt on, just to make sure none of the valves are bent. It sounded fine. Finished putting it back together. It had been a valve or something. Because it just stopped right here, and when I had to take that whole side assembly and power steering pump back loose and start pulling the head off of it. But it did good, so I'll go ahead and put the accessory drive belt on it. I'm going to let the motor down, put the accessory drive belt on it. And I went ahead and draped the belt off of the power steering pump and under the idler pulley, and just scraped off the alternator. Now it needs to go straight off the alternator, around the air conditioner, back up to the water pump, and around the crankshaft. Pry the tensioner down to fish it on. Just make sure your belt's in all of its grooves and generally lined up on all the pulleys. Good enough. I'm going to take the load off of the motor. Put the bolt through this brace. That bar, the motor should be about level. I stuck the bolt in there, but it's not tightened down. Let's just kind of get the motor back where it needs to be relative to the upper mount area. Now I'll drop this body part engine mount down in there. I'll let the motor down. Looks like it might need to let down just a little bit. Fish it. Fish this and this rubber grommet back in on top of this support mount. Set the motor about level where it needs to be with the mount. I dropped these two 13mm down in there and snugged them, but haven't tightened them yet. I'm going to pull the motor forward and stick the bolts down through the engine accessory bracket through the mount. I tighten these two engine mount to bracket bolts to 120 foot-pounds. These two 13mm to 60 foot-pounds, and then stick this plate on there. Is underneath the air conditioner line. These nuts to the body will torque to 55 foot-pounds, and these 55 foot-pounds. Go ahead and let the jack down. Let the motor rest on the mount, and drop the overflow tank back in, and put that hose support bracket back in its place, and a 10mm bolt that holds the overflow down. The engine mounts back down, Mickey Mouse bracket holding the air conditioner line. I went ahead and installed the cruise control back onto the strut tower. Tightened those bolts to 22 foot-pounds. Plugged it back in. This engine lower strut Mount bolt tightens to 74 foot-pounds plus a 90-degree turn. And then just clamp the harnesses and put the plastic back together. Check for leaks. Once the plastic's reinstalled and you don't have any leaks, this one did fine. Put the wheel back on and it tightens down to 100 foot-pounds. Take it off the jack stand. Take it for a little drive.